Welcome to the next part of these podcasts. I'm John Moffatt from the Heathrop Institute at the London Jesuit Centre. We're going to finish our reflections on the themes from prophecy and promise by going back to a central figure in the birth narratives of Matthew and Luke. Mary of Nazareth, Luke, or of Bethlehem, Matthew. Without Mary, there is no birth of the Messiah. A fundamental reality highlighted in the conversation between Mary and the angel in the first chapter of Luke's Gospel. 400 years later, that reality was acknowledged and re-expressed in the evolving theology of Christ's identity as the Council of Ephesus declared that Mary was the Mother of God. For the ancient Catholic churches of East and West, Mary, as the representative of humanity, played a vital role in what theological language labels the economy of salvation. Interest in and veneration of Mary as the mother of Jesus had clearly been a feature of ancient Christianity before the Council, especially at Ephesus itself, where, according to old accounts, Mary had gone to live with the Christian community of John the Evangelist. But now, that veneration became a defining characteristic, shared across the many different traditions and language groups of ancient Christianity within and beyond the Roman Empire, and incidentally, providing a helpful Christian archetype to displace a widespread devotion to the ancient mother goddess, dominant in the ancient Mediterranean and West Asia. In the Latin Christianity of Western Europe, devotion to Our Lady was eventually rejected by the main Protestant churches at the Reformation, even though Luther himself had quite a devotion to Our Lady. She still sits on an ecumenical fault line in conversations with classical evangelical traditions. But that in itself has prompted Roman Catholic theologians to re-emphasize the biblical roots of Mary's story. And some followers of the more Bible-based traditions have begun to rediscover an interest in her. She is a key actor in the biblical narrative, with a story of her own, who had to face recognizable personal and social challenges of her own, and who guarantees that Jesus of Nazareth, the Son of God, is fully rooted in a real, not idealized humanity. Perhaps slightly more unexpected is the importance of Mary as a devotional figure in the Islamic tradition. At Harissa in Lebanon, a huge statue of Our Lady overlooks the Mediterranean and is a shrine of pilgrimage for followers, especially women, of all the different Christian and Muslim sects. A few years ago, all religious groups were able to unite in public celebrations on the Feast of the Annunciation. In this podcast, then, I want to suggest a few ways of making sense of the role of Mary in Roman Catholic theology and practice, particularly for those who find this one of the more puzzling areas of Catholic belief. We'll begin by going back to the core narrative of salvation history. We have already seen how female actors take on a significant role in the Jewish narrative of salvation. Miriam rescues Moses from death and sings a song of triumph over the Egyptians. Deborah goes with the Israelites into battle against the Philistines. Queen Esther pleads with her royal husband on behalf of her people. But a recurring theme is the gift of a child. Again and again we see God fulfilling his promises to his people through the quasi-miraculous gift of a child to a childless woman. Sarah, mother of Isaac, the mother of Samson, and Hannah, the mother of Samuel, all receive the gift of a child, who is at the same time a rescuer of the people. Luke explicitly takes this pattern up into his gospel storytelling. His language, as he describes the child given to Elizabeth and Zechariah, and then to Mary herself, deliberately echoes phrases from those older stories in the Greek Old Testament. He underlines that God is here acting according to type. But of course, in the case of Mary, there is a greater miracle. The child will be conceived by the power of the Holy Spirit. Directly and indirectly, both Matthew and Luke reference the prophecy of Isaiah in its Greek translation. Behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son. In Luke's Gospel, Mary learns from the angel that she is to bear the royal Messiah, the son of David, who will rule and rescue God's people. In a uniquely powerful way, her calling to the work of motherhood represents a denouement in salvation history. She will be acting on behalf of the whole people, of whom she is a part. A crucial moment in the encounter is her assent. May it happen to me as you have said. It has deep and deliberate echoes of the moment where God asks Abraham to leave his homeland for a land of promise, and Abraham accepts God's invitation in faith. Some of the theologians of the Incarnation will take the meaning of her motherhood of the Son of God to its logical conclusion. They will point out that it is in her, human flesh, that the Word becomes flesh. She is a descendant not just of Abraham, but of the original humans. It is thus through her that the nature of God is able to be joined to the nature of humanity. When she speaks her words of assent, she is undertaking a task on behalf not just of her own people, but of the whole of humanity. Those ancient ideas, encapsulated in the phrase Mother of God, are rooted in a combination of scriptural and biological logic. They led to two derivative ideas about Mary, popular in antiquity and the Middle Ages. By the way, because of their antiquity and ubiquity, they are the only two instances in the last 150 years of doctrines that popes have felt confident enough to declare infallible. The first idea reasoned that if Mary provided the physical humanity which allowed the Word to become flesh, then that physical humanity must have been perfect. If that was so, then her body must have been free of any trace of the original sin that affected the rest of humanity. A further step of theological logic reasoned that this meant that she must have had the benefits of redemption by Christ at her own birth and been born without stain of sin. The Roman Catholic Church eventually officially recognized this idea as the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception in 1854 under Pius IX. The second idea reasoned that if Mary's physical humanity was perfect, then her body was ready to be rescued for the life of the new creation without first undergoing physical decay. This fitted in with an ancient tradition that on her deathbed Mary did indeed die, but was then taken up into heaven by angels directly into the life of the resurrection. In 1950, Pius XII officially declared this Assumption of Our Lady into heaven as official teaching of the Church. Orthodox Christians celebrate the same feast but speak of the dormition, the falling asleep of the Mother of God. Both of these doctrines are, in their different ways, extensions of thinking that is fundamental to mainstream Christianity. The Incarnation is real, not an illusion. Christ has a real mother who is born, gives birth, brings up the child, is part of his life and the life of the community he founds, until, in her turn, she dies. Because Christ, the human, lived, died, and rose, human bodies are destined to be a part of the life of the resurrection. Christ's own risen body and the narrative of Mary's dormition encapsulate a primary Christian conviction about the destiny that awaits all believers. That brief sketch reminds us that the Christian narrative tradition is bigger than the canonical books of the New Testament, which already hints at a more substantial background role for Mary in the early community of disciples than might at first appear. John's Gospel has her present, and indeed pushing Jesus to act, at the wedding feast at Cana. She then reappears right at the end of the Gospel at the foot of the cross, witnessing the horror of her son's death. Significantly, in that moment of supreme pain and grief, Jesus gives her to his beloved disciple as a mother, and gives his beloved disciple to her as a son. It is not surprising then to see that in the Acts of the Apostles, Luke describes Mary as present with the brothers of Jesus and the other disciples in the upper room before the coming of the Holy Spirit. Nor is it implausible to suppose that she continued to live with a community of one of the original disciples, John, in Ephesus, as the tradition suggests. Clearly, there is material about Mary from outside the officially approved Gospels, some of it with a distinctly sensationalist tinge. The 2nd century Gospel of James, for instance, offers a backstory describing Mary's birth to Joachim and Anna, her dedication as a virgin in the temple, and the trials and tribulations that arise from her pregnancy, all grafted onto material from the canonical Gospels. Some elements of these narratives from different regional authors have nourished the imaginations of the artists and writers of the Middle Ages and Renaissance. Some have found their way into the Quranic narratives about Mary. One version has Joseph specially chosen as a husband by the temple priests to protect her virginity once she reaches puberty. Incidentally, it provides an explanation for why brothers and sisters of Jesus are mentioned in the Gospels, in spite of the devotional belief that Mary is ever virgin. Joseph is old when he takes up this role, and already has a family. That version also adds a note of dramatic jeopardy when Mary is found to be with a child, and both she and Joseph have to go through a trial by ordeal to prove their innocence. For modern Christians of different denominations who prefer to stay close to canonical text, the starting point for theological reflection is often to situate the gospel narratives in the best available understanding of the social and religious environment. The village environment of 1st century Galilee had clearly defined gender roles and constricting purity laws. But it also had a tradition of women articulating the liberating power of God and having real agency in realizing God's will in the world. The role of Mary in the Gospel places a female presence and a female experience at the heart of salvation history. And her great song in praise of the tyrant-toppling power of God points to a radically different sort of community life in the new age that is dawning. It is important to remember this when reading some male authors' conveniently romanticized views about womanhood, invoking the Virgin Mary as a model and norm for understanding a woman's vocation in the Church. Elizabeth Johnson points out wryly, the simplest feminist analysis makes clear that in the case of actual women, in all their historical concreteness, the categories of virgin and mother come nowhere near summing up the totality of what is possible for women's self-realization. The devotional tradition can be romantic and reductive, but Mary's Magnificat points to a reading of her life that is more interesting and more disruptive. Interestingly, the folk traditions of appearances of Our Lady in the Catholic world do tend to be disruptive, challenging hierarchical control of sacred spaces and providing alternative sources of religious authority. Visionaries often deliver the sort of apocalyptic messages that appear in other charismatic or spirit-inspired traditions. The visions initiate popular religious behavior, very often involving conversion and more intense spiritual life, that regular religious and occasionally secular authorities have to learn to work around. Ruth Harris offers an interesting secular analysis of the appearances of the Lady to Bernadette in Lourdes at a time of extreme polarization between a very secular state and a hierarchical church, each keen to assert their authority. She notes that those secular and ecclesial authorities were consistently outmaneuvered by an uneducated 12-year-old. She also notes that the location and the appearances of the lady seemed to tap into forms of numinosity beyond the bounds of official Christianity. In some ways, the practice and experience of ordinary devotion to Our Lady, like devotion to the rest of the saints, doesn't fit into neat theological boxes. Her near-universal appeal in popular Catholic devotion across the globe is perhaps a reassertion of basic human needs for story and relationship, rather than the harmony of ideas. Catholic churches and imaginations in the West, medieval and modern, have always been populated with different representatives of the heavenly realm, mediators for special occasions, who can, in the moment, somehow seem more accessible, more relatable than the somewhat intimidating persons of the Trinity. The modern Catholic vision of Mary is filtered through the Latin Middle Ages. Our Lady as Queen of Heaven, Mother of the Lord, presides over a crowded heavenly court. As the great King's mother, she has a special authority with her Son, and while the King has to administer justice as well as mercy, his mother is free to show nothing but pity to her suppliants. That sense of Mary as powerful advocate for sinners is captured in the Salve Regina. Hail, Holy Queen, Mother of Mercy, hail. The Memorare prayer, too, captures something of the same sense of longing for and confidence in a merciful hearing. Remember, O most gracious Virgin, that never was it known that anyone who fled to thy protection, implored thy help, or sought thy intercession was left unaided. There are other significant elements, too, in the devotion to the glorified Virgin Mother. There is the sublimated love of generations of celibates for whom she becomes a representative of pure, transcendent beauty. By binding themselves in fidelity to her, they can find some strength against the temptations of earthly love. Then there is the experience of generations of suffering mothers who recognize in the heavenly realm someone who utterly knows what it feels like to live their lives. It is perhaps not surprising that this person has inspired some of the most beautiful and moving musical and visual art in the tradition of the West. At the Second Vatican Council, there was a big effort to recover and promote a theological understanding of Our Lady that would make it easier for particularly Protestant Christians to relate to this key element of Catholic life. The Council stresses the biblical context and narrative, and that central role Mary plays in the mystery of salvation. They take their cue from that scene John gives at the foot of the cross. Mother, here is your Son. They present Mary as the mother of all Christians, a real symbol of the living church, of humanity turning back to God, and a timeless model of the Christian way, focused on Christ and presenting him to a world that needs his healing. Thank you for listening, and see you next episode.